Welcome to the CRO Talk Series, focused on the role and need for the CRO. At Markets and Markets, we find this a very relevant conversation, given that we work with clients to drive revenue impact, and the CRO is the key revenue driving role. I believe each of you will find this discussion and this series fascinating, because in this, you will see experts who have been CROs, you will see venture capitalists, you will see founders, you will see a whole ecosystem around B2B SaaS startups, actually focusing on how growth can be driven in an environment where customer value is paramount and customer choice is a given. Additionally, disruption has become a norm. Whether it is what genomics is doing to healthcare or 5G to the technology industry, drones to aerospace, EVs to auto, or sustainability to every industry. In this perfect storm, at Markets and Markets, we continue to look to help progressive CROs use the right kind of market intelligence to drive unique customer value and expand addressable markets to drive revenue impact. Do enjoy the session. All the very best.
Everyone, good morning, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Markets and Markets Chief Revenue Officer Talk Series. Whether you're a Chief Revenue Officer or heading up sales operations or marketing in your organization, you wake up every morning thinking about how can I grow faster? That will never change. But as your company shifts to a recurring business model where subscriptions take precedence over existing business and new sales, the way that you grow must change. The subscription economy has changed the balance of revenue from focus on new business to recurring revenue from existing customers. The idea behind the position of a Chief Revenue Officer is to unify all the customer-facing roles, right from marketing, sales, demand generation, and customer success under one leadership, and optimize the customer journey from the one-time sale towards lifetime customer value. That being said, it's my great pleasure to welcome our host for today, Deb Deep Sengupta, and our guest speaker, Steve Winter. A brief introduction to Deep. Deep has been my manager for a long time when I was with SAP, and today he's taken on a bigger challenge running advisory work and deep tech startups as an investor and a board advisor. He's helping several mid-stage and late-stage startups with their GTM and growth strategies. He's also an adjunct faculty for London Business School's executive program for CXOs. Currently, Deep is the president and chief revenue officer for Cloud4C, a global cloud managed services company, which helps large and mid-sized businesses in their cloud transformation journey and to truly become cloud native. In addition, to Deep as our host, we have Steve Winter, our guest for the day. Steve Winter is a member of the advisory operations team at Advent International and also an active board member at Xeosk and Alida. He brings over 30 years of sales and marketing leadership experience globally into his current roles. Steve recently retired as the Chief Revenue Officer of Coupa Software, where he was responsible for driving the company's strategy and execution on all revenue-connected aspects of the business. And during his tenure, Coupa had a successful IPO on NASDAQ and continues to experience explosive year-on-year growth. Prior to Coupa, Steve was the EVP of Worldwide Sales and Operations at Marketo, another NASDAQ company. Prior to Marketo, Steve held a number of global leadership positions at SAP, including running the Chief Operations Officer role of North America and the Head of Enterprise Sales. Prior to that, Steve was with PeopleSoft, where he spent 12 long years in sales management roles. Without further ado, I would like to invite Deep to open up the discussion and get started with the CRO Talk series. Over to you, Deep.
Thank you, Vinod. Thank you for the warm welcome and the nice introduction. I'm really delighted to have Steve as our guest for the first season. Steve, welcome to the panel and welcome to the show. But before that, I must thank all our audience and wish them a good morning or an afternoon or evening, wherever you are. So you must be wondering, why another podcast? or a talk show. Let me share my personal journey. I spent close to 3 decades in global enterprise product companies, helping them to scale their operation to a significant size. Over the last few years, what we are witnessing in this part of the region, that's in India, India is developing as a product nation, especially in the software and SaaS business. If I throw some color to this, last year alone, $4.5 billion have been invested by VCs in Indian SaaS companies. Indian SaaS companies are growing at 1.5x than their global peers. Over the next few years, Indian SaaS companies are poised to grow at 6x, create 500,000 new jobs, and create an enterprise value of $1 trillion for all stakeholders. Today, as we speak, there are more than 1,000 SaaS companies in India. However, only 150 of them have reached an annual recurring revenue of $1 million. So what's the problem? What's the problem in scaling? We found that the most brilliant founders often falter during their scaling up for a variety of reasons. And one of them being inadequate focus or investment in GTM. And therein lies my personal interest. I'm convinced about the long-term success of the Indian SaaS community to attain global scale. From my experience, there are 3 fundamental growth drivers in this industry. Number 1, new customer acquisition. Number 2, net revenue retention. And number 3, expansion of average deal size. However, we have our expert, Steve, to talk more about that. Fundamentally, the role of the Chief Revenue Officer has emerged over the last decade, and to look at the growth in a more holistic fashion. So with that, I would first like to thank Steve again for being on the show with us. And I'll hand over to Steve to say a few words before I shoot off my questions to Steve. I have a long list.
All right, can't wait to get started. And Vinod and Deep, great to be working with you guys again. It's been a while since we last worked together back in India with SAP, and I really appreciate you asking me to join you this morning, and looking forward to having a little bit of fun talking about the role of the CRO going forward. Just a little bit about my background. I was one of the early employees, employee 125 at PeopleSoft, and learned a lot, had a great run as we grew that company to well over 5,000 employees, and eventually were acquired by Oracle. And at about that time, I had the opportunity to move over to SAP and took on a lot of different leadership roles there, including running enterprise sales for North America, COO role for North America, and later realized, and I encourage everybody to take this opportunity if you can, to work abroad. Get out of your comfort zone, get out of your home country. And I spent 3 years working in Europe and had a wonderful experience as managing director for the United Kingdom and Ireland, and later had some interim opportunities to spend some time back with Deep and Vinod in India, as well as I spent some time in China. So just a great opportunity there, and came back from that tour, if you will, of Europe, and decided it was time to look for life after SAP, and found an opportunity to work in the SaaS Silicon Valley world and learn more about cloud, as cloud is becoming the new thing. Joined a great company, Marketo, had an opportunity to help Marketo transition beyond SMB into enterprise, and then had a really great opportunity following that to move on to an up-and-coming company that was looking to make their mark in the world and go public, and joined Coupa about a year prior to the IPO, just to get them ready and help them excel and scale and grow revenue in preparation for the IPO. So really exciting experience. Spent 5 years growing that company. And the real work, for those of you who think that IPO is the end, it's really just the beginning, and learned quite a bit about life after the IPO, and the continued pressure and focus on scale and growth. So I've learned a lot. Worked for some big companies, small companies, watched small companies become big companies, and now I have a great opportunity working with Advent International and sharing some of that experience and helping some of their companies grow and scale.
Thank you. That's awesome, Steve. And in fact, the richness and the variety of experience, I'm sure our audience is going to love that, hearing your insights and things like that. So I can't wait to deep dive with you over the next 50 minutes or so. So, and we'll keep it free flowing, Steve. So I hope that's fine with you.
Sure.
So, I was just going through my notes and I suddenly saw a clipping from Forbes back in 2012, which titled the CEO's new secret weapon, Chief Revenue Officer. Right? There's been, almost a decade which has evolved, which has passed when the first terminology came out, possibly as a Chief Revenue Officer. So, Steve, I would love to understand your experience of being, you've played various executive leadership roles. So what is different in a CRO compared to the traditional head of sales, traditional COO, head of operations kind of a role? So, would love to understand your perspective.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And it's interesting. When I first became CRO, it was kind of a title that I believe was created in Silicon Valley because of the complexity around the whole sales model and how that changed around not just sales, but customer value and a full 360 view of how you not just acquire a customer, but how you take that customer through value and through success, and then continue to make sure that that customer stays an advocate for your company for years to come. But I got to tell you, in the very beginning, when I go in and introduce myself as CRO, I get a lot of people looking at me kind of like, well, CRO, isn't that the CFO? And why is the CFO coming and doing a sales call? And I had to say, no, the CRO is a role around being the Chief Revenue Officer, which is responsible for all types of revenue related to the company. So the way I would explain it is my role and the role of my team is to bring the revenue in, and then we hand it over to the CFO and finance to count and manage the revenue for the company. So just a little bit of difference in roles. So once we get past that in meetings and explaining the difference in the role, you then get into more of a traditional sales type of conversation on these meetings. But over time, the role has stuck, and it's become very important for SaaS-based companies to support this role. And I think it really speaks to the fact that it's not just sales anymore, and this role is really becoming part of the C-suite. Thus, the Chief Revenue Officer, Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Executive Officer, and other roles. But it really says a lot about the focus of sales, the focus on customer, the focus on value, and how that is a very relevant C-suite board topic today.
Fantastic, fantastic. Now, I'm sure, when you took on the role or the title of the CRO, right, because you have held many executive positions, obviously you have to explain initially, like you said, what's the difference between the other functions and the CRO, and so on and so forth. So I think that's beautifully put, because we still get a lot of those questions back here. So if I have to ask, what is a CRO accountable for? Is he accountable? Means what would be the key matrices for a CRO? Is it sales? Is it renewals? Is it performance marketing? How would you put, what would be the key matrices around a CRO function, Steve, which would matter for a company, which a company would track and help its growth up, growth journey?
Yeah, great question. But let's elevate it for just a minute. When I think about the role of the Chief Revenue Officer, let's start with strategy. I mean, from the very beginning, the Chief Revenue Officer has to collaborate with Chief Marketing Officer, as well as finance, as well as product, and really fully integrate with the company around strategy on what are we going to do and what are those key growth levers. So when you think about growing revenue, what are the things that we need to focus on? So let's decide what those are first. Then let's think about how we're going to build a scalable organization to focus on delivering on those growth levers. And that starts with understanding, what is our target audience? Who's our ideal customer profile? Then how do we create demand? How do we market to them? In addition to working with the chief marketing officer for building brand awareness for the company, the product, and the technology. And then you've got to go hire and scale a global sales force to support those growth levers and that demand. And then you get into the execution of sales cycle and the importance of predictability and the accuracy of forecasting, and start to manage those more traditional type of sales-based functions.
Oh, fantastic. And, maybe I'll do a little bit of deep dive into each one of these areas, Steve, if you're fine with that. Essentially, you spoke about the strategy, which is so right, because, obviously the strategy has to be a customer-driven strategy to begin with, right? So it has to be a customer-driven strategy. And as a part of that, do you, as a CRO, do you decide, you spoke about moving from SMB to enterprise in one of your stints in your market, or in Coupa, you did a few things. So that's a part of the strategy, right? What's the sweet spot? What's the ICP? What's the ideal customer profile and things like that? So as a CRO of a running operations, right? Do you get to decide on that, or do you get to let me put it this way, work with the executive, with the CEO and things like that, with the leadership team, and decide what would be the if you have to change the segment, if you have to change the target audience, what needs to be done, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, you really, if you're going to become a great company, it starts with a great leadership team, and that's a leadership team that knows how to collaborate, very well together. And I've been very fortunate to work with some great leadership teams, and collaboration was so important. And it begins with understanding the market, and the data will help you understand the market. And that's why it's really important as you transition from head of sales to CRO, as companies grow beyond 30, 40, $50 million in revenue, that you really understand who that ideal customer profile is. So look at what is that sweet spot. And you can then begin to focus and decide, well, we're doing really well in SMB, or we're doing well in enterprise. You know what, we're doing well in both. And you can also look at, well, okay, we're doing well in certain industries. We're doing great in financial services. We're doing well in manufacturing. Well, can we move into professional service-based industries and healthcare and public sector and things like that? And the data will start to dictate that. And then you can work with the rest of the leadership team and really align on where do we want to focus our demand efforts and building out the areas where we've seen success and continue to fuel that. But what's different with the SaaS world over the years and how we've transitioned is, in the old days, you sold a term license and you sold the license one time. And then maybe you would have some add-on products over time that you could sell, and you had maintenance revenue. Well, today, we're in a customer 360 cycle. Our customers always have choice now. And whether it's a 3-year term or a 5-year term, you're always in this continuous mode of driving customer value. So you have to really understand the customer. You've got to understand how to drive value for them. And then you get into this continuous upsell, cross-sell focus, including focusing on renewal. So that's where collaboration with your customer success team is very important. So there's got to be a great handoff to the customer success team, as well as the professional services team, drive the value, but continue to manage that relationship across all those different pillars to make sure that we're continuously driving value and success for customers together as one cohesive leadership team, focusing on one thing, and that's delivering value for your customer.
Yeah, fantastic. And obviously, I think that's the ultimate objective of any organization, and especially for the CRO role. How do you create value? How do you create referenceability? How do you create lighthouse to make repeatability, across various industries and various markets and various geographies? So true about that.
And I would take that one step further. I would just also say, in addition to creating these lighthouse accounts, you really have to create an advocacy program where your customers become an extension of your sales effort.
And speak about their success, about how they're driving benefits using your technology and things like that. So I guess that's pretty much part of the overall program, charter for CRO. As we are speaking, one of the questions which was coming to my mind, which I often get, at what stage of the company's development should somebody go for a CRO? Is it a company which is a post-product market fit, or a company which is trying to attain global scale, or a company which is, what is the right stage of a company to look for a CRO or a integrating function like a CRO?
Yeah, and that really depends on a company by company basis, and what your market is, whether it's SMB or enterprise or both, and industry. But I just think a good rule of thumb is, as your company is starting to grow and excel, and you start to think, well, maybe we're getting within a year or two of an IPO, it probably makes sense then to really elevate the role of sales to a CRO role as you start to prepare. Because then you're going to start having dialogues with different investors or investment banks. You're going to start speaking with analysts, and they're really going to want to hear from a chief revenue officer, what is the growth strategy for the company? How are you going to scale the company? And it's really important in a good transitional time. And I think that's a pretty good area, because at first, you're selling to whoever's going to buy your product. And that's when, as you sell over time, you start to settle in on that ideal customer profile. Then you start to fuel and pour more resources as you start to scale. Then you start to see the momentum, and then you start to thinking, well, wow, I'm approaching 100 million. If I can get to 200, then I'm probably getting in a position where I can IPO the company, if that's what your strategy is at the time. And that's when I really think it's important to think about transitioning from just a head of sales to a CRO. So you have a C-suite spokesperson around that growth strategy of the company to talk to the outside world, but also to bring that internal best practice and discipline to start to put structure in place around operations, around demand generation, around customer success and value driving capabilities to create those customer advocates.
Fantastic. And I think you appropriately put, it has to be at a certain level of maturity for a CRO to come in to be able to add value and scale the company to the next level. Because without those basic, if you don't have the critical mass, or what is called escape velocity, it is very difficult to get somebody as an integrating function to be able to add value. So I think that's a very, very important point. And there are a couple of things which have also come up along with the CRO role. There's a role of chief customer officer. Steve, we spoke about the other day about this, right? Who does what? Because, at the C-suite, you have a chief customer officer, you have a CRO, sometimes you have a CMO. I know there is no formula for that, but it is depending upon what the organization aspirations are and what's the leadership talent you have. But how does the functions, when you have such, I would say, array of C-suite, how would an investor or a customer or a prospect be able to distinguish?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think back about some of the leadership discussions, and I'll go back to my recent days at Coupa, and that was probably, of all my experience, one of the most collaborative C-suites I've ever worked for, and it was based on the great leadership that we had from Rob Bernstein from the top down, but really working together across all the different aspects of the business on one common goal, and that was on driving customer value. So if it's not going to drive customer value, don't do it. But when you think about the delineation between the different roles, as CRO, working with our chief marketing officer was very important around, owning and driving demand generation and creating brand awareness. And really, as we grow and scale a sales force, you're going to invest a lot in building a sales force. You're going to invest a lot in your SDR program for creating demand. But if you don't have a great marketing engine, then you're going to have a lot of salespeople that aren't going to be hitting their numbers and growing and scaling the business. So you start with great alignment with marketing and around demand generation, getting the right tech stack in place, working with a great CMO. And, you know, we had our CMO was probably the best I've ever worked with, you know, Shandar Patalamarami, became a very strong partner of mine as we grew and focused on what we were going to be doing around building pipeline and generating awareness for the company. But then on the right is the chief customer officer. So we're only as good as the success with our customers. So we could have great demand, sell a lot of technology, but if we don't help our customers consume that technology in a very reasonable short time to value, then we're not going to see success and growth. So you go from demand generation to sales to customer satisfaction or customer success team actually deploying and making sure that your customers are consuming and getting value from the technology. And then of course you got to have a great partnership with finance, because they've got to help you manage the budget for and trying to scale within budget to meet the, you know, financial needs of the company. And then I can't, you know, not mention the great relationship with the product team as well, and working very closely, and especially if you're going to grow a global company. And if you're a US based company, a lot of times people don't think about the complexity of operating outside of the US, and they forget that you're dealing with different languages. They forget that you're different with different compliance rules, regulations. So having, you know, a great relationship with your engineering and products team is also extremely important to make sure that you're thinking ahead and meeting the demands of the different markets that you're trying to penetrate, whether it's globally or focusing on different industries that have unique needs.
Fantastic, fantastic. I think it's very, very well put. You know, how you collaborate across the various things to create towards a common objective of creating customer value, because that's the ultimate currency, you know, in which any organization is measured. You know, as a follow-up question to that, you talked about a very interesting comment in, as a response to my previous question, that the role of the CRO many times is also to interact with the investors, especially in a pre-IPO kind of a stage. And now you've been, Steve, on both sides of the table. Now you're on the investor side of the table. Previously, you were on the I would say on the C-suite side of the table. So when you look at both these aspects, from the investor side as well as from the C-suite side, right? What are I would say, what are the critical success factors which can make an organization and a CRO successful? And what are the things which can sometimes go wrong and not almost make it work?
Yeah, and first thing is I always look at the leadership team. You got to bet on strong leadership teams. Okay, if you've got a strong leadership team, you can usually figure out and work out everything else, as long as you have a great product and you're driving innovation. So I look for a strong leadership team. I look for an innovative technology that is something that people need, that's going to add value. So if your product doesn't add value, there's no need in trying to take that product to market. So strong leadership team, strong innovation around the technology, that you're solving real problems, driving value for the company, driving value for the consumer of the technology. And I think those are things that I usually look for and place bets on those teams. The other thing is you've got to understand the financial part of building and scaling. And where I've seen companies make mistakes is when they try to grow or scale too fast, or try to chase markets that maybe aren't best suited. Because sometimes you'll get into a small company and what they'll try to do is you'll try to solve everybody's problem, and you'll get one customer, and then you'll start to change away from your strategic direction to meet the needs of that customer, and then you deviate from what made you good and what made you great. So it's really important that you stay focused on what it is that you're creating, the value you're creating around the innovation that you're delivering, and stay very, very focused. And again, and if you're staying focused and not try to scale too quickly, and scale kind of just in time as you're building it out. But then as you start to really build momentum, then you can think longer term strategically about where you want to make your investments, where you want to go into new industries, where you want to go into new global markets and expand. And the only other thing I would say is if you're going to expand into another global market, you've got to go big into that market. You got to realize that you can't just put a salesperson in the market. If you're going to go into a new market, you got to think, okay, I have to understand the market. I have to understand the product. Does it meet the local needs of this market that I'm going into? Secondly, if I'm going to sell a product, I got to be able to service a product and drive the value for the customers. I need to make sure I go in there with customer success. I go in there with professional services or a strong partner. And from a sales perspective, that I've got solution consulting to support the sales team, and I've got marketing. So you've got to have marketing budget to go in and create brand awareness and demand generation. So, I've seen companies try to just put a salesperson in a new country and say, go be successful. They're not going to be successful unless you're prepared to make full investments in marketing, in customer success, as well as sales as you move into these new markets.
So true. And I think it's a holistic picture. It's not just you can send your foot soldiers, like your salespeople in the market on their own and hope for a miracle to happen. So I guess it's very, very well put. But, Steve, you have seen organization goes on both sides, being both sides of the table, from going private to going public. Now, when you're on private, you have a different set of challenges, right? You will have investors on your cap table, who would, because you have to continue to raise your capital for fueling growth, and investors would expect you to grow faster than what the reality is, right? On the other hand, the same thing, by the way, happens even when you're public. So, I would say, from a leadership team membership perspective, all spotlights goes into the CRO of in driving growth, whether you're private or public. So, that's a limelight and a spotlight one has to continue to manage. So in your personal case, in your personal experience, I would say, Steve, what was your success mantra of managing expectation of both the board, the investors, and both in a private company as well as a public company?
Yeah, I think it depends. There's two ways to look at it. There's a private company that's growing and scaling to become a public company. Then there's the challenges of being a public company. And then there's public companies that may have slowed their accelerated growth and then are penalized in the markets. And then some of those will go private again and try to reinvent themselves and come back at a later date. So it's a very interesting balance. Early on, when you're private and you're growing, it's all about doing everything you can to quickly gain market share, get product to market, grow and scale. And that's usually where your investments are. And if you're making the right decisions, then you'll find yourself growing and scaling as long as you have, again, a product that's innovative and delivering value to the customer. And as you go through the process of growing that company, and you're not quite public yet, one of the advantages there is your decisions aren't driven by quarterly performance. So you can make decisions whether this is a good decision timing wise or not. And it gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're private, but at the same time, when you're private and growing, the investors are obviously stepping on the gas, grow, accelerate, fuel. And again, I just always am cautious not to try to grow too fast. I've seen people flood the market too early with too many salespeople. And what happens is 20-30% of those salespeople are successful, the other 40-60% are not, and you end up having people term and leave, and you have a lot of attrition, and then you have to cut back, and then you grow and you scale again. So as a private company, growth is extremely important. Just be very calculated in how you time out that growth, and don't overinvest too soon in growing the business. But then once you're public, you are on that quarterly merry-go-round. So everything is about execution. It's about profitable growth. And it's about, being predictable to the analysts that are now measuring you in public markets. So my only caution there is be real with yourself and set goals that you know that you're going to be able to achieve. And you got to plan that way ahead of an IPO. You got to do that early to know that I can get on a growth trajectory of 35 or 40 or 45% growth once you're public, and build enough runway to make sure that you can maintain that. In the event that you don't over time, some companies have slowed, 4 or 5 years out. And that's where sometimes private equity will come in and take a company private, but they take them private to give them a chance to take a deep breath. Let's reset. Let's get our strategy right. And maybe we need to look at doing a couple of acquisitions that are going to make our value prop stronger. Maybe we need to retool some things that we've been doing in marketing or sales, but it gives you a chance to do that outside of the public eye. And then I've seen some very great exits again for companies, second exits, either through acquisition or a future IPO as a better, stronger company. The idea is not to have to go that route, but it does happen for companies that see accelerated growth after they've gone public. Then they start to slow, and then there's an opportunity to maybe regroup through private equity options.
We recently also saw some companies which went from public to private. Some major companies. So,
and I've seen all of the different cycles and working with companies. 2 companies that have gone public, one that was public, one that was public went private, and then one that went public again. So it's interesting to see the dynamics in both of those models.
So no, that's very fascinating, Steve, to understand your perspective on this. Maybe just changing track a little bit. The role of the CRO is also to be in what we used to call as a player coach, right? Onboard people, coach them to be successful. So whether it's on the sales side, whether it's on any critical aspects, growth aspects of the company. So and you have often mentioned about building a strong leadership. So as we focus on creating demand pipeline, is there enough focus on creating talent pipeline in growth stage, or because that's also very, very important to scale an organization, right? While we all focus on the demand side of the business, but the talent side is also equally important, especially when you're trying to grow through your GTM-led strategies.
Deep, you're spot on, and I can't stress the importance, and I think at least 20% of my time as CRO was focused on recruiting and enabling and building great teams. And if you build great teams, the rest of the job is much easier. And I can't tell you how hard it is to get people to realize that recruiting is a key part of the role and the job, regardless of what level you are, in the business and recruiting. And, we would spend a lot of time recruiting and always recruiting ahead. And I'll explain how important that is, because there are situations, especially in early stage companies, where finance will give you a budget and that's it. That's your budget. But what they don't factor into that sometimes is attrition and ramp time. So you've got to have a good partnership with finance and HR that says, you know what, we're going to hire 15, 20% ahead of plan. Now that's your goal. Then I guarantee you're only going to hire to 100%, because then you're going to balance the attrition. You always underestimate the time to recruit. You underestimate the time to enable. So then you get into the conversation around ramped quota.
Exactly.
So when I always looked at, next year's planning, I always started recruiting 6 months or earlier from the plan for the next year, so that you're always getting ahead of that growth curve. And you'll find out that you balance that with attrition and growth, so that when you do get to next year's plan, you now have an enabled sales team. So it does require that you hire just a little bit ahead. And it's more than just hiring. you've got to have a strong enablement program. When you talked about coaching and mentoring,
Right.
so important to have strong enablement, and not just one week boot camp or 2 week of boot camp. You've got to have continuous education to continue to support and enable your sales force over time, and especially around new product introduction, new industry introduction. Things are going to change over time. So you really need to have a dynamic enablement program. So, I encourage people to build your plan for the next year, hire ahead, and put a strong enablement plan in place, and then spend time with your direct reports that you support. And I always just made it a habit where I would have at least a one-on-one once a week with my direct reports, and I encourage them to do that with their team. And of course, the first part of the call is talking about forecast and deals, but I always made sure there was time left over to talk about recruiting and to talk about what was going on with them personally. Is there anything that I could do to help? So don't always make the conversation, and that's the difference in the CRO and the salesman. Don't make the conversation just about forecasting. You have to do the basics around forecasting, but allow time to talk about the recruiting aspect and to talk about some of the things that might be going on, with them, with their team, with personnel, and them as an individual, and coach and mentor them as a person.
Fantastic. Awesome. And in fact, I was expecting an answer almost in line with that, because knowing you, Steve, you always focus on the talent. I think that's fantastic. And I guess it's a continuous journey. And then I think what you said is not just onboarding people and not leaving them in the deep seas on their own, but having a proper mentoring, onboarding, and I would say ramp up program. Without that, it's very difficult, especially with the at the account executive level, especially if you're hiring a lot of field reps and things like that. You've got to make them successful.
And too often in sales, we hire them, we send them to boot camp for a week or two, then we throw them to the wolves. And if you don't support them, and I mentioned it earlier on, with a really strong demand gen program, a great SDR program, so they can collaborate around creating pipeline. And then you got to support them in the field. And you know me pretty well. I don't sit behind a desk. So as a leader, you have to get out in the field a little bit, lead by example. Write letters for them, open doors, help, elevate. And we always talked in sales about climbing the ladder, and too many times people get stuck very low in an organization. Use your executive presence to elevate the conversation to get back to the boardroom.
Absolutely. So I think it's fascinating, Steve, to learn from you about your experience. It's so true. Maybe one final question I have. I won't hold you back any longer. You talked about the strategy. A key part of a strategy is also your product development and your product roadmap, right? Because as you scale organization, because you're end of the day creating customer value through our platform, through our technology, through our product, right? And as you move from one segment to another segment, from one industry to another industry, especially in a growth stage company, it's a continuous process of product market fit for every new industry you get into, every new geography you get into, and every new, as you already spoke about that, whether it's regulation, whether it is business rules, today with data privacy, all these becomes very, very critical. And these are, at least clients in various parts of the world expect this to be given as embedded in the product. And many a times products or companies may not be already ready for that. So what do you think is the role of the CRO to help, I would say, guide or help provide that input to the development and the engineering teams?
Yeah. Love that question. And I probably didn't emphasize enough how much time I spent with some of our product management members of the team and different organizations that I've worked with, but especially at Coupa. We had very strong product management people. Matter of fact, I would take them on sales calls, and sometimes we would leave the sales team out and I would just take a product management person. We'd go in and meet with the C-suite and talk strategically about product. But if you think about where you learn the most about the value you can give to customers, it comes from customers, you learn from them, you learn from analysts, and then you learn from prospects and your competition as you're talking and you're learning, and it really all comes together. So whenever I could, I would try to get product management involved in some of our most complex opportunities so that they could hear firsthand from the prospect or the customer to really understand what they needed. And then if you take that information and input with the information that the analysts are giving you about where the market is going, then you can really think strategically about how you want to continue to drive innovation. And one of the things I talked about much earlier when you talked about, what are the key success criteria, I talked about one was innovative technology. That's a journey. That's not just something that happens up front. And the best way to keep that innovative journey going is to keep your product management team engaged with your sales team in the field. And then, of course, you have great marketing people that can put the wrapper around all that and have you take it to market, with the sales team. But I mean, I love that question, and not enough people do that. And I don't think enough people have respect for what really goes into product management and engineering to build and deliver scalable product that brings value to their customers. And I like to emphasize that. I just think it's super important. And too often you hear salespeople complaining about the product. Oh, I lost the deal because. That's BS. You didn't lose the deal because. Okay, nobody has a perfect solution, but it's how you present that, it's how you collaborate, it's how you partner, it's how you build vision for a future roadmap. And the only way to really do that is to have alignment with the sales and product management and engineering function. And that starts with the CRO and the head of engineering and the head of product. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. So really, really awesome. And at least I'm sure our audience will get a lot of insights from this conversation. Steve, I really appreciate you spending the time and early morning your time. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to have you as the first, I would say, guest of our show. So thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Well, great. You're very welcome. And Deep and Vinod, again, thank you for inviting me to participate. And as always, wonderful to see you guys again, and look forward to doing this again sometime soon.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you,
guys. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks.